when the UPA government came to power in 2004, I think in the first Independence Day speech that Manmohan Singh gave, said, cities, the urban, will be the driver of the growth of the future. In other words, well, urban was taken seriously, but then the cities were a place where you lived and also produced. Wealth creation did happen in our cities, but it was also a place where you lived. A space to live was an important consideration. In a city like Hyderabad, for instance, you had, right from the late 70s, people, the poor, the workers, the slums, people who lived in the slums were given ownership, what they call the deformed pattas. In other words, land, the house in which they lived, the land on which their house was placed was given to them, formally, ownership. But then suddenly, the city came to be defined in terms of a commodity, capital. It's a place of wealth creation. And how you lived, where you lived, didn't matter. Now, if we look at the scenario today, India still continues to be predominantly rural. About 67% of India's population still live in the villages, in rural areas. However, urbanization has accelerated. If you look at this 2010-2015 figures, the annual average growth of the urban is 2.38%. When you compare it with the rural growth, it is only 0.7%. The rural growth is extremely slow when compared to the urban growth. An estimated 180 million rural residents live next to the 70 largest urban centers. This is something that is again interesting. A huge number of people who live around the cities. In 2011, socioeconomic and caste census, there are 7,933 cities and towns of different population sizes, including mega cities of over 10 million plus inhabitants. Now, if you look at the right to housing per se, India has ratified the core human rights instruments. Now, the International Convention on Social, Cultural, Economic and Cultural Rights, India ratified in 1979. And Article 11(1) of which contains provisions on the right to adequate housing. And Article 2 on the right to non-discrimination, and Article 2(1) on progressive realization of the rights recognized in the covenant, using the maximum available resources. In other words, India has ratified core UN human rights conventions that guarantee a right to housing in some form or other. Similarly, it ratified the International Convention on Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination in 1968. The Convention on the Rights of the Child in 92, CEDAW in 1993, and Rights of Persons with Disabilities in 2007. In other words, India is bound by international conventions that India has ratified. At the national level, if you look on the housing scenario, housing and land fall under the state jurisdiction. It's not under the central jurisdiction. But at the same time, central government can introduce national housing programs. And the government of India has been introducing housing programs right from, I think, the second 5-year plan onwards, right from the 50s. Housing the urban poor especially has been a concern of the government of India, of the central government. You have the 73rd and 74th amendments that decentralizes governance. Now, is there constitutional protection when you talk of a right to housing? Is there any constitutional protection? As it is, of course, the Constitution of India talks about justice, liberty and equality, but it does not explicitly enumerate the right to adequate housing as a justiciable right, except that Article 21 talks about life, right to life with dignity, right to life with equality. But otherwise, in fact, 2 years ago, I think, a question was asked in the Parliament: will the government of India, with the new developments that were happening, will housing be made a fundamental right? And the answer was no. In other words, housing in India is not a fundamental right. But Article 21 has come to be interpreted in such a way that right to adequate housing becomes a fundamental right and is justiciable. One thing that is interesting is that things that were lying in the directive principles is gradually becoming rights. Now, for instance, right to food, right to work have become justiciable rights. So in other words, there is a path that is being followed where housing could become a fundamental right if the same principles are followed. Same principles, right to food, right to education, right to work. Now there is a struggle to say that right to health should be made a fundamental right. If that tangent of interpretation is followed, then right to housing can become a fundamental right in India. India is a flourishing economy with estimates of the real gross domestic product of in 2016 it was 7.3%. Now it has come down. In other words, it's a growing economy, and urbanization is considered a driver, as I said, of this growth of producing wealth. 60% of the GDP comes from the urban centers, perhaps even more. If that is so, then taking care of its working class is an important duty of the government for its own sake. If workers are taken care of, it's a win-win situation. And that is the reason the UPA government did come up with Rajiv Awas Yojana. There were other schemes that government came up with. Now, if you look at the housing shortage, what's the housing shortage in India? The census data, urban housing stock increased by 52.06 million in 2001 to 78.48 million in 2011, during that period, that decadal growth of housing stock. Accomplished through various policies and programs, initiatives like you had JN and URM, you had lots of other things that there has been a considerable growth in the housing stock. This is something that we can pat ourselves about. In 2012, there were 18.78 million housing units shortage in the urban areas. Something that is very interesting is that, and about 96% of them came from the economically weaker sections. They say is that almost 91% the economically weaker sections and the rest in the low income group. So the housing shortage, it is one class of people who are the victims of the huge housing shortage that exists. But that is something that is very interesting is also that on the other side, there are about 13 million houses in the urban areas that are lying vacant. In other words, it is a second house, it is a third house. It is somebody who is living, who might have a house in Hyderabad, another in Bombay, another in Delhi, and another in New York. And they might use it occasionally. And these are huge houses that are lying vacant, which means a normal family, maybe in one house, 3 or 4 or 5 families can be, if they are provided that possibility. So in other words, there is no housing shortage in urban India really. So people like us have been asking that if you want to own a second house, let them pay for it, tax them so exorbitantly that they will not be tempted to keep a house vacant. In other words, in real terms, in the urban areas, there is no real shortage. It is political will, it's a political decision that need to be taken. the 2011 census showed there is 1.8 million people who are homeless. And that they say is a very low estimate. Researchers say that the estimate probably would be 3 million who are homeless in our cities. Now, that is the urban scenario. In the rural area, in the rural scenario, 40 million rural housing units, there is a shortage of 40 million housing units. 90% of rural households requiring housing are living below poverty line. And they say about 56% of the homeless have no land at all. In other words, they neither have a house nor land to build a house on in the rural context. Now, if you look at the essential services that are necessary to, when you talk of adequate housing, see, often the government of India talks only about affordable housing, but not adequate housing. Adequate housing, to live with dignity, you need minimum facilities. If you look at the whole economically weaker section housing scheme, it has always been one bedroom housing. I have lived in one of those, in the slum that I was talking about. You have a small little room, you have a small toilet, you have a small kitchen, and that's what you have. And ever since, one of the things that I have been arguing is that this is not meant for a family. How can a family live with dignity in a house like that? We have been asking that the whole housing scheme, the economically weaker section housing, has to at least have minimum of 2 bedrooms. A family can live decently. No, I've seen a lot of criminality take place because of these matchboxes. Families, incest, all sorts of things happen in families because of these matchboxes that are into which people are condemned to live. And in Telangana, the government has accepted this scheme of building 2-bedroom housing, 565 square feet houses. They are supposed to build 200,000 houses, 1 lakh houses in Hyderabad and 1 lakh houses, more than 1 lakh. In fact, it is, I think the final figure is 2,36,000 or something. And surprisingly, I was looking at the figures today. About, in Hyderabad at least, 93,000 of the 1 lakh houses that are to be built in Hyderabad, 93,000 houses have been already launched, which is, we had helped, at least with the community organization, of the pilot project that was built of this 2-bedroom housing in IDH colony. The housing is pretty good. You have 2 rooms, 2 toilets, a sit-out. So, and this is something, and we want this to succeed. When you talk about adequate housing, we want this to succeed in Telangana so that it can become a model for the rest of the country. PMAY talks about 1 lakh rupees for housing. Now, what can you build with 1 lakh rupees? Actual situation is 1/3 of the households do not have access to electricity in the urban areas. 70% lack clean, safe and affordable energy for cooking. In 2015, piped water in urban areas, it was only 50%, 54% of the population that had piped water coming. In rural areas, it was only 16%. In 2015, 63% sanitation facilities, there has been an improvement with Swachh Bharat, but 10% still resort to open defecation. I am quoting it from the HUPA India Habitat 3 report. Together, they are expected to significantly improve infrastructure, livability, and economic productivity in urban areas, and aim to achieve incremental and qualitative improvements in the living conditions of all urban Indians. Now, if you look at Prime Minister's Awas Yojana, the urban, there are 2 components to it. One is the urban and the Grameen. Now, what does the urban project talk about? It talks about building 20 million houses in urban areas, potentially housing 100 million people in by 2022. right? I was part of a working group in that NAC on domestic workers. And then the people who talked, they invited us. And one of the things that I saw is that that office welcomed the civil society and gave, welcomed ideas. People who were working at the grassroots, they always said, please come, tell us what is the best solution. So there was a process of dialogue that, and many of these, whether we talk of RTE, where I right to food, PESA, whichever you talk, many of the things that came from the NAC, there was a lot of civil society participation that happened. Now that type of possibility is not there. Civil society participation in policy making, in schemes, making schemes doesn't seem to exist anymore. But PMAY is an ambitious project. It has been critiqued. It has been critiqued for many reasons, but then it is an ambitious project. Now, if you look at it is based on the recognition that as far as possible, slum rehabilitation should occur in situ. This is something that is a provision that is still left in PMAY. Eligible residents of informal settlements provided temporary, they are supposed to be provided temporary accommodation when the houses are being built. But something very unfortunate that is happening in this 2-bedroom housing scheme is that their houses are demolished and said, okay, you are told you go and find your houses until the housing is ready. Now, we never know to whom these houses will go. They have been all evicted. People who have been living, they have been all evicted, whether they can come back and whether they will get a housing. This is something that is, but then in PMAY at least that possibility is there. Once new houses are constructed, households are provided with a unit equipped with the basic services, and then a one-time payment is to be made. Maintenance cost is to be covered for 10 years by the developers, and then the residents are responsible and become the Grameen 10 million houses in rural areas are to be built with different. Now there are some major concerns as far as PMAY are concerned. There is a single emphasis on home ownership. Other possibilities, now not all need to own houses really. There are people who migrate and live in the city for a period of time. What they need are rental houses. How will the, now as it is, PMAY does not give access to housing for the homeless people. Now in other words, a whole complex reality of urban housing, urban vehicle section housing in the urban areas are not really addressed by PMAY. Rental housing and other things. Affordability of those informal settlements is a concern. Not able to access credit-based subsidies, people, because they can't afford even subsidized loans. Results in residents having to stay in transition camps for long. The unit size in Delhi, I am told, it is as small as 30 square meters. Is it? 30 square meters is pretty. Is it 30 square meters? Regardless of family size, whether that is adequate or not. In other words, the units are too small. Now, smart cities you already know, but then as far as smart cities is concerned, housing for the urban poor is a very strong and important component of the smart cities. But unfortunately, the way things are happening, that is that resources that should have been utilized for housing the urban poor is taken for technology and development of infrastructure. And the smart cities happen in small spaces and well-off cities, because it's a competition. So cities that need housing for the poor, they are not often selected into this. There are a lot of inadequacies that happen in that context. As of now, 13.7 million households between 60 to 70 million people in urban areas live in extremely inadequate housing situations in India today. There has been a growth from 2001 to 2011, if you look, a 37% growth of so-called informal settlements. And this trend is likely to continue because of the the urbanization process is something that is happening. Evictions evictions continuously happen, but then we have no numbers. One of the studies that talked about 2010 to 2015, about 250,000 houses were demolished, evicted, in the name of development in our urban areas alone. So this is something that happened with little protection. Discrimination in housing is another major factor. Women are discriminated in terms of housing, especially single women, widows, who have, or women who are victims of domestic violence. These people, these women have nowhere to go. Homeless women. So this, there is a process that scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in the urban areas. I have gone to, at least in Hyderabad, I have gone to hundreds and hundreds of slums in my last 27, 28 years of my work with the urban poor. Invariably, I would find it is the scheduled castes, it is the scheduled tribes, it is the backward classes and minorities. I have hardly found an upper caste person living in a slum, at least in Hyderabad. Bombay, I know, is different. But in Hyderabad, I have hardly found in the last 27, 28 years. Housing is not accessible to them. Even rental housing. I remember when I first went to the slum, I didn't want to live in the slum because I was afraid. So I went to a nearby locality to get to ask if I can get a room. So the first question they asked me was whether you are a vegetarian or a non-vegetarian, because they couldn't make out what caste I belong to from my name. So they asked me a supplementary question, whether you are a vegetarian or a non-vegetarian. And I was innocent, I was very naive. I said, I eat whatever I get. And I was not given housing. I didn't get a house. Muslims, there have been enough studies that have been made where Muslims are not provided rental housing. Scheduled castes, scheduled tribes. In other words, there is a whole deal of discrimination that takes place in terms of housing. Access to justice. People, the most vulnerable people basically have no access to rights. The lawyer who has taken so much of money from the people, these are people who are sanitary workers, rat pickers really. From 2010, this case has been on, and he must have taken lakhs of rupees from them. And yet, a crucial stage comes when he should have appeared and the case could have been resolved. He just refused to appear in the court. He simply refused to appear in the court. So, access to justice is something that. Now, there are lots of ways in which, in terms of policy, in terms of schemes, that. But we need housing as a fundamental right. We need to have a legislation that ensures that housing is a fundamental right. We can have schemes, but our problems will remain. Our problems will remain. And the state, they come up with brilliant schemes, but schemes change with each government. Okay, UPA had schemes. Now, though they are no more there. Now the new government and the next government will come up with some other schemes. We need entitlements as far as housing is concerned. We need entitlements as far as basic amenities are concerned. And this is, I think, okay, we can have lots of possibilities, but then this fundamental aspect that we need housing as a fundamental right, this is something I think all of us need to, especially when you are, because as you saw, 96% of those who do not have houses are people who are at the bottom of the society. And if we are talking about a developed India, we are talking about a country of the future, then if you do not take care of this basic need of the security of a house where people can live with dignity, if that is not provided, we will never be developed. We might sit in the security in the UN Security Council, but if our most vulnerable people are not provided the minimum of the ability to live with dignity, the means to live with dignity, I think our country will never can be called a developed country, a country that is looking to the future. So I close with that.